even though, of course, I probably don't need that. I should turn it on for others. Welcome to PNCA. My name is Mac McFarland. I'm the director of the Center for Contemporary Art and Culture here at PNCA. And it's really my pleasure tonight to get to welcome Brian Holmes back to PNCA. Before we get started, I just want to take a moment to recognize that we are on the unceded lands of the Multnomah and Clackamas people, that we are guests on this stolen land, and that we should remember to be good guests, respectful, and remember that the land was taken from them in a pretty violent manner, and that should not be overlooked. I think that the land and empathy is something you might hear about later again tonight. So Brian is here and will be shortly joined by Claire Pentecost. Claire has work up in the Dorothy Lemelson Innovation Studio as part of the exhibition of Converge 45. And Claire will be speaking in this room on Friday at 6:30 p.m. And I would highly encourage you to come hear her as well. Brian and Claire are here as we work together to expand and bring an exhibition to PNCA in 2018 called The Earth Will Not Abide. This exhibition was up at the University of Chicago last year. And the exhibition poses questions about the ecological and social viability of industrial agriculture and extractive land use, and attempts to understand the rapid transformation in land use, biological diversity, and social structures wrought by monocultures, and envision how the analytical tools of political ecology allow us to visualize and critique this subject while also pointing us in the direction of viable responses. I'm really excited to be working with Brian and Claire, as well as Ryan Griffins, Sarah Ross, Alejandra Mahinta, Sarah Lewinston, and again, Claire on this exhibition. And I really think this viable responses is another theme that threads its way through a lot of what Brian and his collaborators have been doing. I have to say it's been a pretty amazing and really fun 23 hours with Brian so far. We've had a range of conversations. We've talked about the role of guilt and its relationship to progressive thinking, and how that process of guilt sometimes drives us, and that coupled with the lack of acknowledgement from actors on the far right who refuse to acknowledge our humanity cause us to infight and call each other out. And we tend to forget that we are probably more aligned than we realize. We've also discussed our past interest and involvement with net art and those sort of metaphorical strategies, and how we've both had a turn to more grassroots or direct involvement. We've also talked about the weather, of course, not just the changing weather, but also too of the winds blowing in Northern California, in the burning towns of Santa Rosa and other locations. I really got to know Brian's work, or really maybe found out about him in a 2005-ish interview that I read in a magazine I can't even recall. I do remember the subject was about the Continental Drift seminars, which I'll speak about in a minute. And I just recall that there was a complexity and a human delivery in his interview that just really struck me and was thought-provoking in the most compelling ways that make you want to act. Since then, in 2013, we brought Brian to PNCA along with the Critical Art Ensemble with a project that they did called the Keep Hope Alive Block Party, which was an amazing spectacle, those of you who might remember it. And then Brian was here and really engaged in a couple of classes, and he delivered a talk at that time as well called Tactical Media in the Neoliberal Era, the Helicopter View. And this This talk makes a reference to a critical art ensemble work that some of you might guess. And it was in that talk that I really learned about this beautiful West German film from 1984 called Decoder, that is loosely based on a William S. Burroughs book. And I would highly recommend you go and YouTubing that when you get home this evening. Brian holds a doctorate in the Romance Languages and Literatures from the University of California in Berkeley. He was the English editor of the Documenta 10 publications in 1997. Brian likes to think and write about the coming collapse of our ecosystem and of other things, about the Anthropocene, about art and culture's role in social organizing, in political economies, and grassroots resistance. He's a co-founder of 16 Beaver, and along with Claire Pentecost, he co-organized the Continental Drift seminars from 2005 to 2011. And these were a sort of experimental educational experiences that really leapt and expanded upon the situation concepts of psychogeography, especially the derive. And if you're sort of interested in that, I would check out the text Drifting Through the Grid from 2003, which marries some of those early ideas with this interest in net art, in fact. Brian is the author of a couple books, more than I will name, in fact: Escape the Overcode, Activist Art in the Control Society, Unleashing the Collective Phantoms, and he wrote the foreword for Critical Art Ensemble's monograph, Disturbances, published in 2012. And recently, Brian was interviewed for a book called Politics of Study in Open Editions, which we have in the PNCA library, as well as his other books as well. So I would definitely check those out. Brian is sometimes a philosophy professor at the European Graduate School, as well as the University of Illinois. And he is a member of the Compass Group, who are exploring the Midwest radical corridors. And he is a damn fine cook. Please help welcome Brian Holmes.
Okay. If possible, could you turn that light that's the spotlight down or off even? That would be great. Anyway, thanks for that introduction, Mac. That's wonderful. It's great to be here. This is a kind of an awaited moment because we've been planning this for a while and planning further events here with the upcoming showing of The Earth Will Not Abide. So I'm really glad to kick this off with an essay that I've recently written. An essay is a particular form, one that doesn't imply a position of mastery from the writer at the outset. It's rather a kind of adventure. You test yourself out on a new ground. You sort of assay an unfamiliar and uncertain situation. And that's from that kind of exploratory mode that this piece of work springs. I was thinking that since this is an art school, it might be interesting to talk about what's usually not mentioned, which is how sometimes things like this come about. I received an invitation from good friends with whom I've worked a lot in Germany to come to a talk, and the subject was going to be, of this conference, was going to be proxy politics. So by proxy politics, they meant, a machine like an internet server that would serve as camouflage for some, disguised activity. I don't know what. I mean, I received this invitation, as one often does, and I thought, well, what can I possibly do with that subject? At the same time, I really had to go to Europe, I really needed to make that journey at that time. And as I was preparing to write back and say, no, I'm sorry, I just don't have anything to say about it, suddenly this idea sprang to mind. And this is the great thing, I think, about writing essays in my experience, and it probably works this way with making artwork too, is that at a certain point, you get an idea that synthesizes everything that you're concerned with. And the reason it can synthesize that is because of a certain form, a certain click, a certain metaphor, which then is filled up and transformed, in this case in a way that brought it far away from the intention of the people who invited me, but also, I think, expanded the whole subject for them as for myself. So the whole thing turned out pretty well, and I just wanted to say that to art students too, because this is sort of how it works. You don't entirely plan out everything you do. You have to act sometimes in situations that give you a possibility. So this essay springs from a simple possibility like that. It's called Empathy Machines, Emergent Organs for an Eco-Body. You're sad, you're mad, you're not so young anymore, and the climate's going to hell on you every day. So you look in the mirror and think, maybe it's time to adopt a pixel. Fortunately, you can get one for free, direct from the US Geological Service. It comes from a Landsat sensor that beams it down from outer space. Your pixel is a proxy for the planet, a representative of that vast constituency called Earth. When it makes its appearance on the screen, it's a tiny, almost invisible dot in a scientific datascape, corresponding to one specific piece of territory about 30 meters on a side. The problem is, it's an orphan, a nobody, with no personality, no qualities, and only a generic name, like urban land, agricultural land, forest land, wetland, etc. To adopt such a pixel, just do like this. Mark any given spot with a handy GPS device and point your camera down at your feet. Click. Then turn south, east, north, and west, clicking a photo each time. And finally, look up into the air where the satellites live. Click again. Send those 6 images back to USGS, and the feedback loop is complete. Your little pixel has grown up. It knows what it is, where it is, who it is. You have contributed some ground truth to Earth science. By becoming part of the remote sensing machine, you help make abstract information into a place, a tangible reality that someone might actually care about someday. Acting in this way, I've developed a relation with the pixels of the environmental sciences. Not just the ones borrowed from a random USGS webpage, but instead those that can be found in a dizzying range of geographical images emanating from public research labs across the planet. Since 2016, I've been building up a map of the Mississippi River and Great Lakes watersheds, whose dividing line runs through the city of Chicago, where I live. To create this work, which is called Living Rivers, I've been adopting pixels like crazy, combining them into aesthetic forms and ground truthing them whenever possible. The hope is that this artistic process will help make people more sensitive to the air we breathe, the water we drink, and the ground beneath our feet. Maps are crucial perceptual tools for the new political ecology because they point outward, beyond themselves, beyond ourselves, toward the territory. They are proxies that do not feign, that do not hide, and that do not even try to dissimulate, though their enemies will always accuse them of lying. They represent the biogeochemical cycles of Gaia at scales from the microscopic to the macrocosmic. And they ask us to care about those biogeochemical cycles as though they were part of our own metabolism. The questions of this project involve complex structures of knowledge mediated by aesthetics forms and disrupted by political conflicts. Yet at the same time, these questions are very intimate. What is ecological empathy? How do people establish a connection with worlds beyond their own perception? When does a proxy get under your skin? Living Rivers explores 4 fundamental categories of territorial experience. Biomes are characteristic habitats combining plant, animal, fungal, and bacterial species. Anthromes, or anthropogenic biomes, are violently simplified ecologies, engineered across vast spaces by human beings and their machines. One example is the endless corn-soy anthrome of the Midwest, where I live. Wars are flashpoints where the human onslaught against what used to be called nature reaches explosive proportions. Finally, visions spring from the exercise of expressive capacities, overflowing the subject-object divide and reshaping the expressive agency itself through encounters with both human and non-human others. The cartography of the Mississippi and Great Lakes watershed was developed in tandem with another map, Ríos Vivos, by Alejandro Metin of the Argentinian group A la Plástica. Metin has been exploring precarious life in the Paraguay-Paraná River Basin over the last 25 years. He works with island-dwelling villagers, environmental activists, scientists, and artists within the changing context of a vast river, wetlands, and estuary system, itself surrounded by an expanding corn-soy anthrome. We developed our parallel inquiries within an exhibition project called The Earth Will Not Abide, which includes pieces by Hieroglyphs, Sarah Ross, Claire Pentecost, and Sarah Lewison. The project explores the often devastating footprint of industrial agriculture in North and South America, with an additional look at peasant resistance in the new center of global economic development, which not coincidentally is also the world's largest market for genetically modified grains, namely China. It was really an uncanny experience to make this map of living rivers in the summer and fall of 2016. As I worked, the protests against the Dakota Access Pipeline grew. The black snake of DAPL writhed through the upper Midwest, sinking its venomous fangs into the oil hub of Patoka in southern Illinois. You could hear and feel the pain of the Native Americans through the cries in the streets, the images in the papers, the videos on the net, and the stories told by travelers coming back from North Dakota. "Water is life" was the chant heard again and again. Things move so fast now, and I think this event, which happened only a year ago, now seems like ancient history. I want to take just a moment to allow you to think back on it a little bit.
Most of us women, we linked arms and we went up to the front line and we started pushing through, and we weren't like literally pushing, we were just walking, and this guy comes, he's a private contractor security, and he started spraying her, and then he started spraying right along everyone who was linked up.
I don't know how to get this thing, my whole body is all hot.
What's your name? Where are you from?
We're in Flying Horse from Bullet, South Dakota.
Set the dogs on us and they started spraying us. Before I got sprayed, I seen dogs biting people indiscriminately, including Dakota Access Pipeline workers.
I was just going toward the truck with my dog, and then the guy just leaned out and pepper sprayed me. Thankfully, he didn't hit my dog, but I just got mace all up in my eyes.
Oh my God.
people! With our people! For one nation! For one nation! We stand! We stand! For water! For water! For life! For life! We stand!
This no image here has a meaning you're going to discover in a second. This thing of working in such a way that what you're working on seems suddenly to become the main subject that everyone is thinking about, I think it's something inherent in social communication. This happens relatively often in one's life. This really happened to me because when I began making Living Rivers, the no DAPL movement hadn't started. So it's really something strong to feel, even though you're far distant and far separated from a group of people, to feel that somehow you are linked before a common perception, and with a common emotion. I think that's really impressive. However, and this is what the image that I don't want to show, as the struggle against DAPL unfolded, Trump was running his yet more venomous campaign. The worlds I was striving to visualize in the map were the ones that he wanted to banish from all consideration. Trump's people said that the NASA satellites should be pointed toward outer space, not Earth. His administration is a direct attack on our civilization's organs of perception. I felt like the eyes were being ripped out of my head. Why are these two things simultaneous? What makes love and hatred correspond in these ways? The latest installment in the theory of empathy comes from an unlikely source, the leading EU consultant on the emerging technologies of the Third Industrial Revolution. Noted author and distinguished professor at the Wharton Business School, Jeremy Rifkin is an American counterculturalist who came of age in the 1960s. He's from the East Coast, not California. He's like something like a hardball version of the hippie entrepreneur Stuart Brand. The complex of ideas that Rifkin sells to the Eurocrats is really very simple. Replace the corporate military oil complex with renewable energies. Develop a smart electric grid to power small-scale distributed manufacturing. Promote equal exchange between associated producers via the latest in computer-orchestrated logistics. And use the markets of this new industrial system to entice China along the pathways of sustainable development in the 21st century. Unlike the usual dreamers, and this is the amazing thing, Rifkin is actually getting this done via multi-million euro projects in various EU countries. But just like the usual dreamers, he knows that success is all about empathy. Rifkin has studied Renaissance literature and mirror neurons, and he understands empathy as a foundational process of human development, both in the life history of individuals and in the history of civilizations. Somehow, you have to perceive the emotional landscape of the other and then internalize that landscape, however imperfectly. This allows you to experiment with an affective relationship in kinesthetic thought, in advance of those split seconds of real encounter that will make all the difference between love and hate, peace and war. Empathy is the highly uncertain, thoroughly speculative process of feeling someone else's feelings, whether through dreams, fantasies, painted images, literature, film, electronic media, or as yet undiscovered means. It's the psychic movement whereby an other stands out and becomes salient in your awareness. It's not an end point, but the condition of possibility for a response, an engagement, an action, whether directly or at a distance. Sure, you can be against empathy and in favor of a coolly rational compassion, as the author of a recent polemic would have it. There's a book out there called Against Empathy. but I think you might as well be against imagination. The point is not to attain the ultimate intellectual purity. The point is learning how to make better use of a basic human faculty which is currently being abused on a massive scale. Since the advent of Twitter, we are living in the age of the emo wars. Long before the populists grabbed the headlines of every newspaper, Rifkin cut to the heart of the conflict between love and hate. His key idea is that every expansion of the productive apparatus of civilization necessarily brings innovative communication techniques which serve to control and coordinate the new machines. We saw this in the 1990s when the internet emerged to coordinate the global capacities of just-in-time industrial production. At the same time, the new communication techniques enlarge and deepen our capacity for empathy. The problem is, however, that every expansion of the productive forces also brings greater capacities for the destruction of the environment, resulting in fear, hostility, and backlashes of all kinds. So the communications techniques themselves can turn around and morph into something strange and threatening. There's a double bind at work here, what Rifkin calls an empathic entropic paradox, whereby civilization's increasing complexity continually threatens it with dispersal and dissolution. The empathic entropic paradox has now, according to Rifkin, reached planetary scale. And I quote from Rifkin, "The early light of global empathic consciousness is dimmed by the growing recognition that it may come too late to address the specter of climate change and the possible extinction of the human species, a demise brought on by the evolution of ever more complex energy-consuming economic and social arrangements that allow us to deepen our sense of selfhood, bring more diverse people together, extend our empathic embrace, and expand human consciousness." We are in a race to biosphere consciousness in a world facing the threat of extinction. Rifkin's book, a really impressive and interesting book called The Empathic Civilization, was written in the 2000s during the rise of social media, but also under the shadows of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars. It focuses mainly on the relations between humans of different classes, countries, and races. But it's clear from the book, and more broadly from contemporary experience, that the empathic embrace of a viable 21st century civilization must extend beyond human beings to the untold millions of other species that are menaced by imminent extinction. At the extreme, it's about feeling out the emotional landscape of the landscape itself in its radical non-human otherness. Only by doing so right now, through aesthetic as well as scientific means, can we generate a hitherto absent capacity to respond to the weirdly entropic spirals of all-consuming progress and growth that have engulfed the entire biosphere. Otherwise, those entropic forces, typified by the release and ubiquitous dispersal of CO2 in the atmosphere, will push us dramatically beyond the so-called limits to growth, or what Earth systems scientists now call the planetary boundaries. Today's neopopulism denies those limits, which threaten its partisans at the core of their real or imagined privileges. For them, the threat is not objective. It has nothing to do with science, remote sensing, ground truth, or any of that. Instead, it arises from anything that would force them to admit the existence of other beings with different priorities. Stay white is their grotesque call of identitarian solidarity. And you can bet it also means stay straight. Trumpism, in particular, stands squarely against two things: environmental politics and the liberation of those whom the dominant elites still call the minorities. The populist refusal to countenance the affective presence of the multiracial and multi-species other is matched by a direct emotional appeal to the fears and aggressions of a declining national imperial constituency. The cattle kings, the engineering moguls, the coal, oil, and gas extractivists, the military, the manufacturers, the shoot-from-the-hip police, and the financial aristocrats who profit from all the simmering resentment. That's a tremendous alignment of forces, but a desperate one, which constantly seems to be collapsing from its own contradictions. On the streets, on the net, in workplaces, on campuses, in the mainstream media, and even out in the almost forgotten countryside, Trumpism is being opposed by the biggest, broadest, deepest wave of activism, legal obstructionism, philosophical condemnation, and popular disdain that I've seen since my tender childhood back in the late 1960s. The emo wars are in full swing, and no one can yet predict the outcome. So what about those satellites that I was talking about before? They are to ecological activism what cell phone cameras are to Black Lives Matter. They provide streaming images, graphic representations, proxies of the real. When the videos of officer-involved murders are adopted and expressed by outraged black and brown activists, you get the huge cross-racial movement against police impunity. When the cool, abstract data of the environmental sciences are adopted and expressed by impassioned individuals and groups, you get the climate justice movement. Spanning the globe with its powerful proxies, the climate movement turns data into knowledge. Then it turns knowledge into aesthetic forms, and finally, it turns aesthetic forms into action. The middle phase, where empathy emerges, is not the least important one. Ecological empathy machines constitute a new and particularly urgent realm of aesthetic production, even when they are devoted to the daunting vastness of biogeochemical cycles, or to the unsettling connections between human beings and the deep time of global ecological change. Some leading exponents of these aesthetic forms, which have directly inspired us in the Midwest, can be found in the artists of the World of Matter collective. But there are innumerable such examples of empathy machines in cinema, literature, photography, experimental media, and in the sciences themselves, or out in the streets. Operating both within and far beyond the institutionally recognized disciplines of art, the influence of these expressive assemblages has already been profound, and it will undoubtedly continue to grow. As current dynamics in the US reveal, that influence is fundamentally political. What I'm calling empathy machines are the latest face of an age-old contradiction, whereby the instrumental means of capitalist control and coordination become the expressive instruments of liberation. At a time of extreme social polarization, when it's necessary to take sides in massive conflicts where one remains suspicious of all the sides involved, it's become particularly interesting, I think, for artists to reach out to scientists. It's clear that the latter are finally taking on explicitly partisan roles in the face of crude efforts to silence them, particularly by defunding their laboratories. What's at stake, though, is not only the defense of publicly conducted research, nor is it only an imperative to politicize science, as though one could simply do away with the centuries-old attempt to attain a position of objectivity. Instead, the real stakes for aesthetic production are to be found in the possibilities that the environmental sciences offer for a fresh extension of human perception, and therefore of civilizational empathy. The fact that this most recent extension of empathy should be carried out through the highly rational images of science rather than those of romantic poetry speaks of a new constellation that leaves the old reason-emotion debates far behind. And I think you might see this in the work of Claire Pentecost when she comes later on in the week. There are some other things to think about concerning the turn toward empathy machines. By accepting to become part of the feedback loop that brings existential ground truth into the datascapes of satellite-based science, one integrates oneself to the planetary mapping infrastructure of the world geodetic system, as I pointed out years ago in a text called Drifting Through the Grid. Yet the reduction of individual autonomy that follows from this integration to the remote sensing machines holds a hidden promise, which is only now coming into view. This is interesting to me because when I first realized the degree to which we could become part of vast surveillance networks, like everyone, I was horrified. And I reacted against it. I criticized it. I also did, activism in that direction and cultural activism. But now I see something, a kind of promise emerging, which is a bit strange, but it's because of the changing times. It's also because of the changing role that science and scientists have in these times. And so the promise that I see emerging is that of gaining a species capacity to perceive our interdependence with the vast oceanic and atmospheric circulations that are part and parcel of the evolution of life on Earth. The major challenge is to actively shape this new, more highly integrated feedback regime, whereby we can collectively temper our damaging behaviors at the level of the population. Alejandro Metin, with whom I worked on Living Rivers, Rios Vivos, holds similar ideas. Whoops, I think I'm going to have to see if I can get back to that. Hello? He believes that the dynamic equilibrium of the South American river basin where he lives, or what he calls the homeostasis of the watershed, is not maintained by the state and the engineering companies, but instead by the grassroots physical labor of the people who inhabit it, through their forms of cultivation, animal care, habitat protection, stream maintenance, pollution and flood control, etc. Much of his work takes place at the expressive and communicational level, strengthening the inhabitants' capacities for intuitive collaboration. So he says that what really allows the territory to go on existing is not the new dam that gets installed. It's not the cement wall that presents a flood. It's a vast and self-coordinated activity of people who have become sensitive to their environment through their experience of it and of its changes. This is really a grassroots view of how you adapt in real time to the changes of an environment. And for Alejandro, this is something like a feedback system. It's very, very interesting the way that he analyzes this based both on his experience and on the concepts that he and many Latin Americans use, which are, for people who are involved with science, often a kind of forward-looking, quasi-utopian understanding of what a complex adaptive system is. So I found that fascinating in our conversation, his emphasis on the way that the inhabitants maintain the dynamic balance, or what's called the homeostasis of the watershed. Could a more empathic civilization rediscover such directly democratic practices, but at an industrial order of magnitude? Here again, we would have to explore a possible integration with informational technologies constituting emergent perceptual organs for a very different kind of body than the one we have hitherto known. The mapping projects seek in that direction. They are both perceptual prosthetics and fields of ecological imagination, like the landscape paintings of centuries past, but under wildly different environmental and social conditions. In any event, it's clear that a new circuit of perception, imagination, expression, and action is already a driving force at the species level. The scientific perception of global climate change lies behind the adoption of renewable energy technologies and small footprint manufacturing toolkits, which Rifkin and hundreds of other high-level planners are now struggling to make into a viable industrial norm. In this effort, empathy machines will not make all the difference, but they will make some of it. This has been a short but wildly speculative text. It deserves to end on a visionary note. So I'm going to ask a strange kind of question. Could it be that the pixels of the environmental sciences, those tiny little proxies of planet Earth, have actually been adopting us all along? I'm thinking of an essay by Dorian Sagan from a book he co-published with his mother, the remarkable microbiologist Lynn Margulis. Pursuing the Gaia theory developed by Margulis and James Lovelock, Sagan attempts, and I quote, to imagine a child of a present or future culture inculcated from childhood to believe that the planetary surface formed a real extension of his person. It strikes me that Sagan himself might know something rather intimate about that kind of childhood. It's really curious. He's conceiving a time, maybe even the present, when the proxies of the environmental sciences have quite literally gotten under the extended trans-individual skin of what used to be called humanity. He continues his reverie of the Gaian child, and I quote, he says, "The mountains between earth and air would seem to him anatomically placed, as our skeleton is between our bone marrow and flesh." Then he abruptly switches genders to conclude his intimate flight of scientific fancy. Imagine someone from this culture picnicking. She believes her environment to be part of herself. The grass on which she sits is a patch of tissue lining the inside of the superorganism of which she forms a part. The bark at her back, the dragonflies, the birds, the clouds, the moist air, and the ants tickling her foot. All these sensations represent, from her point of view, self-perception. Like the ants, she senses what is beyond her. When she pulls her t-shirt over her knees, this is no longer human, but one locus of sensation within the kaleidoscopic entrails of a planet-sized photosynthesizing being. Let it go. You've been human long enough. Imagine the eco-body.
We have time for some questions if anybody out there has any.
I'm curious about the relationship. I'm not familiar with the Continental Drift project. What's the relationship between the map and the activities on the ground?
In the Living Rivers.
Grassroots activity that's actually maintaining the river. So how does the
Yes.
mapping relate to that?
There I was speaking particularly about the part made by Alejandro Metin, so in South America, in Argentina, while in the Paraguay River Basin. The way that the mapping is new for him. He's been doing this for 25 years. But across those 25 years, he and the group, Ala Plastica, have been elaborating forms of representation which allow people to gain in an understanding of what they're doing, in the way that art usually does. You know, it gives you a way to ask new questions of yourself and other people, a way to feel new things. You know, and that's a role that artists have, I think, in social movements generally, and it's one that becomes really interesting in the context of the attempt to gain a different relation to the ecology, to other beings, animals, plants, and so on. And you can see that in artistic practices now. We, from the Compass Group in the Midwest, really recognized what we were trying to do in Alejandro's activities and vice versa. That's why we started to work together, actually. So, I mean, we haven't been doing it for 25 years like him. I sort of owe quite a lot of recognition to this guy and his friends, because it's deep what they've been doing. What they've been doing, you would have to look more deeply into it, which you can do by looking at on the website at the map. But what they've been doing is collaborating with inhabitants, both people who are struggling to make a living from along the edges of the river and the wetlands, and also with political activists, with scientists, and so on. So the role of art is this communicational, reflexive, expressive role, I think. And that's certainly, I think that's where we really fit in as aesthetic producers, when we try to put that outside the walls of institutions and really bring our productions into contact with different communities.
Brian, is it you specifically that's doing the map renderings, or is it part of the Compass group? How are the maps taking information and becoming a visual form?
Well, the mapping work is mine and Alejandro's.
Okay.
I've done all the work creating the software objects and also the sort of backgrounds, the base maps. Then Alejandro's actually, I was very happy, was able to appropriate that and fill it all with his own content and writing and all that. So it's a tool, and the point of this, one of the ideas with this tool is to gradually expand it and make it more available to other people. It would have to be made a little simpler to work with before other people could really appropriate it easily. But that is the direction that I want to go. It's open source stuff. None of this is owned. It didn't exist before it was written. There's also David Reuter is in the room who helped write it. A bit of it, part of it anyway, there we go, during the early phases, and there have been other people along with me who have written the program, And then a lot of the material that's in there is coming from public science, and this is something I became a lot more aware of public science by doing this work, and a lot more aware of what it could contribute and has been contributing for a long time to our capacity to perceive and to feel. There was a question here, and then there.
Yeah, I'm interested in this image specifically, and how the border is drawn, why, and what is being separated.
Okay, that's a great question. That's the image of not one but two watersheds. So the two watersheds are the Great Lakes watershed and the Mississippi River watershed. What does that mean? It means that water that surges up from the earth or falls to the ground here or at any point in this area flows ultimately to the sea through the Mississippi River. So that river defines a watershed. It so happens that the watershed that it defines, the border of that watershed runs right through the city of Chicago. So in making this map, I couldn't really restrict myself to the Mississippi River. I had to add the Great Lakes. So there's two big watersheds. The Great Lakes, all the water that flows up there in that area is going out up there and into the St. Lawrence Seaway and ultimately out to the Atlantic Ocean. So that's a concept that grows out of the observation of how water flows, and it's been used for a long, long time. Also by visionaries who want to create another form of boundary for a kind of eco-politics. There's a tremendous history of that in this region where you have this idea of Cascadia based on in some formulations it's based on the outline of the Columbia River watershed, which similarly draws a territory that extends up into what we call Canada, out into what we call Montana, and so on. It's another large system. And watersheds, you see if you look at the map online, it's kind of nested thing because, if you spill a glass of water on the ground, it defines a a watershed? You know, where does it flow into? A small stream flows into a larger stream, into a larger one. So you can define progressively larger watersheds.
Thank you.
There was another question. Oh, there you go.
So I think one of your previous questions answered that question I was going to ask, but just to make sure I guess clarified. So this project you put together, this program, I understand this is ultimately going to be improved upon and simplified for mass use. So it's going to function as sort of an enriched version of the USGS adopted pixel thing that somebody can use to have a more deeper grasp.
Yes, this is what I really hope. I mean, the adopted pixel thing I found to be a kind of a joke because I thought, oh my God, this encapsulates two things that really interest me. One, that you can kind of somehow appropriate yourself a little bit of information that you enrich with, say, your own perception mediated by a camera, you know? You take something that has almost no qualities, very little information, and maybe tells you that this is a wetland, or maybe it tells you that this is urban ground. And you give it much more information with, so by adding to it. That was one idea. The other idea is that integrates you and your activity into a planetary mapping mechanism. That's the scary part. Now, this is happening to us all the time, mostly thanks to these little devices here. But you're mapping this like crazy. And if you have a Fitbit, metabolism is being very, very well mapped, and there's a gigantic, synthesis of that around it. Whether we like it or not, that's happening. Can we become conscious of that and begin to take this process and guide it in more interesting ways? That's what I'm now interested in. I've kind of given up. I think that, these surveillance machines aren't going to go away. But what I think would be interesting is to develop them in a way that renders us sensitive to what's going on in the environment rather than desensitizing us. Because now what it does is try to target your attention towards mostly commercial offerings, entertainment, and so on, with an added benefit to the state that wants to surveil you. What if we start to proactively shape this regime of sensing and use it to sense other things, like what's happening to the environment? That's what I would like to do. I think this is already ongoing. I think this is happening even on a very large scale. I would like to participate in it. And of course, I would like to share that possibility with other people. So, did that answer the question? Yeah. So I do hope to make a kind of kit, because right now to make this thing work, you have to open up those files that are called code and deal with them now. So maybe that could be overcome at some point.
I have a question now.
Yeah.
I was just wondering, it seems like when you say sensing, a lot of what the sensing that is happening is very visual, and I'm wondering if you thought about other senses, human senses, to amplify that empathy.
Yeah, I think I think the visual part and the visual part that's kind of data visualization is the hardest, coldest, most abstract form possible. In a way, I wanted to sort of say that even there's a form of empathy that's being developed. The great thing about maps is that they lead you to places, or they make you more curious about places that you already know. I think this is the other part. This is the embodied experience, the experience of direct engagement, and then that can lead to the production of other expressive forms also. I don't see an opposition between representation and reality. I see a dynamic between the two. So I think there's this dynamic thing. I think the way that we shape that dynamic is really the very sort of tonality of our lives, right? And it also gives a certain tone, an affective tone, to society. Its rhythms are the rhythms of movement between representation and embodiment, where things happen to you that you don't understand, and you can also produce things you don't understand. That's really expression. Expression is different from representation, which you're making it and you don't understand. So that dynamic between the two, between representation and embodiment, is what really interests me, broadly in life. And that is to say that, not complete. It's only part of a kind of what you can call a practice. And the practice is indeed what interests me. I mean, otherwise we would be stuck with rather poor notions if all we had were abstract images. So I like your question, and your drift,
Pretty good, and I thought to how you might use something like this to start pushing concerns into the surveillance system that are not its normal concerns and that aren't the ones that are desired by the ruling powers.
Yeah, of course, obviously. I mean, definitely, without a doubt. And I think that, there are many forms of that. And in a way, I've been doing this for a while in different, sort of formats. But what interests me now as the ecological situation becomes so threatened, let's say it outright, and so politically charged, are the activities that are doing what you say. You have, for instance, right now, the multiplication of cameras that serve to help people who care understand things about wildlife that people could never observe before. And this is happening, it's happening in different ways. Hunters use these cameras a lot, But now wildlife management people are using them. I find that very interesting. I would like to find a way to tap into some things like that, which are really about remote sensing in a way that makes us more sensitive to beings which are not us. I mean, there's always a limit to that. I mean, by capturing an image in a camera, you also reduce that entity to a very small reflection of what it is. That's where you need to constantly go beyond, and follow that way that a map or any representation points outside of itself. And I think that, to not do that is to just get lost in representation. But if you do that, then something much more interesting starts to happen. And this is really happening now. And it's happening under a general feeling that we need to do something to change the way the civilization is being articulated, the way it's tone, its rhythm, its general process. And so I'm fascinated. Of course I want to do that. And that would be now one of the versions, there are many, of what I would see maybe more as an evolutionary politics than a revolutionary one. But that little R is always somehow there under a parenthesis.
I'm curious what makes a scientific image or a map empathic or empathetic. Science has a long history of violence associated with its imageries. And kind of a related question is a term that I think is kind of newly circulating is empathy fatigue. Like we see so much and we're exposed to so much that there's a sense of just kind of shutting down. So how does an image sort of gain control of our capacity for empathy?
I'm not sure an image gains control. I think the capacity for empathy is something that one exercises. It's a faculty that one exercises. And so, of course, there are many attempts to gain control of that faculty by using images and other means in particular ways. The entire history of television, of commercial mass communications, of propaganda, and we can go on and on and on, are such histories. But there are other histories which we have a lot of access to through art, through the practice of the creation of parks and gardens, literature, where the point is not so much to control someone's faculties, but to kind of accompany them in the development of their own capacity to exercise these faculties, to bring them into play in certain ways. And that's the way I look at it. I mean, if you suffer from empathy fatigue, it's not going to work. The image is not suddenly going to change you. You have to meet it halfway and then go beyond at any point to something else. And I think that's just the way it is, I don't think there's a magic bullet, as they say, for that one,
That's actually related to the question I had, which is that
Yeah,
background
right.
knowledge, and then people will respond to that. Whereas I think that in many avenues, it seems like one of the sort of things in activist culture is that people don't necessarily, you just give people a bunch of facts and assume that they're going to rationally decide to do the right thing, but that's not actually how it works. So there is somewhere in there that needs to be translated to a form that actually moves people.
Yes, this is kind of what I was saying. Yeah. This, yeah. Go on. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm just, the question like, is there a story, or there's a narrative, or there's a story, or there's something that makes those facts resonate to some degree.
Well,
Through this reactive feedback.
yeah. I think that's the case. I think that that's really the aesthetic moment. Facts are not it. Somehow the fact has to become part of your life, and I think that happens through this weird process where you start to feel yourself in someone else's or something else's place. When you start to imagine that the world could be different, these things have to do with a type of activity of the imagination, the feelings, and so on that can be touched off by certain things. And we all know from activist experience that what touches that off is really, really different. There's no one thing that does that. That's also why I said, this type of ecological art is not going to do everything. However, it is clearly doing some things. And I think it's not only coming from artists. I think it's coming from scientists, strongly from activists who have largely, I used to do this a lot, integrated aesthetic production into the activism to make, the attitude that you've come to hold more accessible to people as an intensity, not as something simplified or something, but rather as an intensity that can become part of their care about things. What makes them care enough to take an action. And so that moment where something becomes meaningful, where it becomes alive, where it becomes salient to you, it steps out of the rest and starts to matter for you. I think that's the moment, you can call it by many names, the aesthetic moment, the moment of the imagination, the moment of subjectivity. But anyway, that moment stands between, facts or knowledge or whatever and action in a way that, and so it was a kind of student, you're right. Yeah.
Maybe one more. You mentioned homeostasis
Uh-huh.
at like a watershed or bioregional scale, and seem to be describing that as a goal to seek, if I'm understanding correctly. Does that seem feasible in a time of rapid ecological and social change?
Well, homeostasis, this is this word that I kind of brought into the conversation through Alejandro. It's a totally cybernetic word. But where did it come from before it was a cybernetic word? It comes from the physiologist canon, And so it's about a kind of dynamic equilibrium that is not, homeostasis is a sort of higher level of energy that fluctuates between boundaries. So it has what they call a metastability. Probably familiar with these concepts. Now, in the present era, we know we're going through a transformation in this metastability. That's now unavoidable due to the amount of CO2, methane, and so on that are in the atmosphere, and to many, many other things. In fact, all of Earth system science, which totally fascinates me at this point, is about trying to understand the feedbacks that disrupt present conditions, but somehow tend to seek another metastability, another homeostasis. We are now facing the great unknown. We don't know what's going to happen. We know that, I think it seems pretty clear that this moment is a change, what also in complexity theory is called a phase change. That means that you have chaotic things going on and there's no clear homeostasis. There's no clear stability of the system. Well, they said, may you live in interesting times, and we all do. So that's kind of my thinking in a nutshell on that.
Thank you so much, Brian.
Well, thanks for the question.
another talk through the MFA Collaborative Design Program, Reducing Inequity on the Finite Planet, how equality is the underappreciated cornerstone of a sustainable society. And I think that's going to be a really amazing talk to follow up
That sounds good.
what
Yeah.
we just had here tonight. And that's with Chuck Collins and Rob Dietz. So 6:30 back in here for that one.
6:30, not 6.
6:30. Tomorrow.